In the interior of São Paulo, a single man's body became a factory. Roque José Florêncio, remembered in local memory as Pata Seca, was forced not only into backbreaking field labor but into a role that stripped him of personhood. He was made to father hundreds of children for plantation profit. Conservative estimates place that number at 200 or more. He was taken as a child from Angola, shipped across the Atlantic, and delivered into a system that, when imports slowed, deliberately turned reproduction into capital. Picture the household ledger, the auction block, the calculus that turned human bodies into investments. Over the next 40 minutes we will follow records, baptisms, oral histories, and laws to trace how one man's body became a multiplying engine for wealth, and to ask what such a history leaves behind. Stay until the end to see the full arc, how law, market, memory, and kinship intersect in a story that still shapes lives today. This account will prioritize documentation and testimony, archival ledgers, baptismal registers, contemporary laws, and the local oral tradition will be our guides. Claims lacking corroboration will be flagged for verification. Watch closely and critically. If this kind of evidence-first history matters to you, subscribe to Disturbing Tale, like if you want hard truth, and comment one question you want us to chase in the notes below. The story of Roque José Florêncio, later remembered as Pata Seca, begins far from the coffee fields of Brazil. It begins in Angola, on Africa's western coast, in the late 1820s. At this time, Portuguese-controlled Angola was one of the largest departure points for the Atlantic slave trade. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, millions of men, women, and children were shipped from ports such as Luanda and Benguela across the ocean to Brazil, Cuba, and the Caribbean. In the interior of Angola, oral accounts suggest that Roque was born free, around 1828, in a community whose specific name has not survived. Childhood in these regions typically involved close ties to extended kin groups, communal farming, and initiation into local cultural traditions. But the reach of European traders and their African intermediaries was vast. Raids, kidnappings, and conflicts between rival groups increasingly fed captives into the trade. Roque was around 6 or 7 years old when his life was violently interrupted. He was taken in one of these raids. We do not know if his parents survived the attack or what resistance they attempted, because the records left by traffickers were silent about family bonds. What we know is that the child was marched toward the coast, probably tethered with other captives, and then confined in barracuns, holding pens, until he could be loaded onto a ship. For a child, the experience must have been incomprehensible. Enslaved children often cried out for their parents during the forced marches, and witnesses described the trauma of separation as among the most devastating moments of capture. Once on board a slave ship, Roque entered what survivors later described as a floating prison. Contemporary accounts testify to the conditions: wooden platforms so low that even children could barely sit upright, chains that cut into wrists and ankles, unbearable heat in the ship's hold, the constant stench of sweat, blood, vomit, and human waste. Mortality on such voyages ranged from 12% to 20%. Children faced a particular vulnerability. Some died of malnutrition, others of diseases like dysentery and smallpox. Those who survived were often permanently scarred, physically and emotionally. Brazil, unlike the United States, continued to import enslaved Africans in large numbers until the mid-19th century. Historians estimate that nearly 40% of all Africans trafficked in the transatlantic slave trade ended up in Brazil. The ships carrying children like Roque often docked in Rio de Janeiro or Salvador before redistributing captives inland to the coffee-growing regions of São Paulo. The crossing could last from 6 weeks to several months, depending on winds and weather. Survivors described hallucinations, the mingling of languages from dozens of African ethnic groups, and the sheer confusion of being thrust into a system they could not yet understand. Roque endured this ordeal as a boy, and when he finally stepped onto Brazilian soil, he was no longer a free child of Angola. He was merchandise, marked for sale. By the 1830s, Brazil's coffee boom was beginning to transform São Paulo into one of the most profitable plantation regions in the world. Coffee was becoming what sugar had been in earlier centuries, green gold. To sustain the demand, enslavers needed laborers to clear land, plant, harvest, and carry heavy sacks of beans to market. Roque was likely auctioned at one of Brazil's major slave markets, perhaps Rio de Janeiro, which at its peak processed tens of thousands of enslaved Africans annually. Prices for young boys varied, but a child was considered a long-term investment, less immediately productive but with the potential for decades of labor ahead. From there, he was transported inland to São Carlos, a developing plantation district of São Paulo. It was here that the Fazenda Santa Eudóxia, sometimes recorded as Santa Eudóxia, would become the site of his life story. Plantations like Santa Eudóxia operated as self-contained worlds. Dozens or hundreds of enslaved Africans lived in senzalas, rows of communal barracks often overcrowded and poorly ventilated. Work began before sunrise. Boys were typically assigned light tasks at first, carrying water, tending fires, or helping in the fields. As they grew, they were integrated into the brutal cycle of coffee production. Roque's body, however, did not grow typically. Oral traditions describe him as developing extraordinary height and strength, eventually surpassing 7 feet tall. His unusual stature became his most visible characteristic. Plantation society quickly turned it into a marker of difference, and later, of exploitation. The nickname, Pata Seca, meaning dry foot, was attached to him during this period. Some say it referred to his ability to wade through rivers without wetting his feet, others to a medical condition that caused his feet not to sweat. Whatever its origin, the name functioned as a label of possession. Enslavers often renamed captives, erasing their birth names and replacing them with terms that reinforced control. By the 1850s, pressure from Britain forced Brazil to formally end the transatlantic slave trade. The law of 1850, Eusebio de Quiro's law, outlawed the importation of enslaved Africans. But coffee planters still demanded labor. The result was a shift in strategy. Instead of buying new captives from Africa, they sought to breed enslaved people already in Brazil. This was not unique to Brazil. In the United States, after the 1808 ban on the Atlantic trade, states like Virginia and Maryland became major centers of slave breeding, supplying enslaved labor to the expanding cotton frontier. In Brazil, the change meant that planters looked at young men and women on their estates not only as laborers, but as reproductive capital. Roque's towering frame, his physical endurance, and his lack of visible disability marked him as a candidate. Plantation ledgers often contain chilling notes about enslaved people's breeding potential. Women were valued for fertility, men for physical strength and traits that could be passed to offspring. At Santa Eudóxia, Roque had already distinguished himself with his field work. Oral accounts say he could carry loads that would break other men's backs, and he worked without apparent collapse in conditions that destroyed many of his peers. To his master, these attributes were not just useful, they were profitable. The decision to repurpose Roque's life came in adulthood, when he had reached his full size and endurance. The exact year is unclear, but historians infer it was sometime in the 1840s or 1850s, when the pressure to maintain the enslaved population without imports grew most intense. He was moved from his role as a field worker into a new position, enforced reproduction. From that point onward, his body would be used not only for labor but to generate new generations of enslaved children. The process was cold, calculated, and systematic. Records of enslaved populations in São Paulo often noted offspring by X male, treating human children like entries in livestock accounts. Roque's transformation into breeding stock was not a personal choice. It was an imposition, a redefinition of his humanity for economic gain. His own will was irrelevant. The enslaved women he was paired with had no choice either. Their consent was impossible within the institution of slavery. And so, the boy taken from Angola, who had survived the Middle Passage, who had grown into a giant in the coffee fields, now faced a new fate, one even more intimate in its violation. That beginning was not accidental. It was the prelude to a deliberate plan, to turn people into capital by design. The ledger explains the rest. By the mid-19th century, Brazil's plantation economy faced a problem. Coffee had become one of the world's most valuable commodities, feeding the growing demand in Europe and the United States. São Paulo's interior soil was ideal for production, but its prosperity depended on labor. When Britain pressured Brazil to end the transatlantic slave trade, the supply of new captives from Africa dried up. The Eusebio de Queiroz Law of 1850 officially banned the importation of enslaved Africans. But the plantations were expanding, not contracting. Planters had cleared new tracts of land, built more fazendas, and invested in infrastructure. They could not afford to see their labor force dwindle. In response, they turned inward and devised a solution chilling in its efficiency. They would create new laborers by forcing reproduction among those they already enslaved. The logic was cold but direct. A woman of childbearing age could, under normal conditions, give birth to a child every 2 to 3 years. If even half those children survived to adulthood, she could produce 5 or more future workers over her lifetime. To enslavers, this represented a renewable investment. Each child was both future labor and potential capital on the slave market. The costs of sustaining children, basic food and shelter, were minimal compared to the market price of an adult worker. Enslavers thus calculated the long-term value of women's fertility in purely economic terms. Mothers were not seen as parents, but as producers of property. In this system, men like Roque José Florêncio, known by his imposed name Seca, were redefined as reproductive tools. His exceptional height, strength, and apparent endurance made him a particularly valuable asset. Planters believed these traits could be passed on genetically, producing stronger children who would yield more labor or fetch higher prices. The comparison to livestock was not metaphorical, it was literal. Plantation records often listed enslaved men and women alongside notes on their qualities and offspring. In some cases, they even tracked which men fathered which children, with notations that resemble animal breeding registers. Not every man on a plantation was chosen for this role. Enslavers applied selection criteria that revealed how dehumanizing their calculations were. They sought men who displayed unusual physical attributes, height, muscularity, stamina, showed no obvious physical impairments or disabilities, survived the brutal workload of field labor with fewer collapses, were young enough to father many children but mature enough to demonstrate endurance. Seca met all of these requirements. Oral accounts describe him towering above his peers, performing the work of several men, and rarely showing signs of exhaustion. To his master at Santa Eudóxia, this made him more than labor. It made him an investment multiplier. Selection was not just physical. Enslavers also observed temperament. Men considered rebellious were often excluded from breeding because they might transmit a spirit of resistance. Those considered docile or quiet were preferred. Oral traditions describe Seca as withdrawn, speaking little, a trait that may have been survival strategy but also marked him as suitable in the eyes of his master. Once chosen, the man's role shifted. He was placed in quarters separate from the usual field workers and was paired with women selected by the master. These women, too, were often chosen for perceived fertility and physical health. Some were from Santa Eudóxia itself, others may have been brought from neighboring plantations specifically for this purpose. Consent was impossible. The women had no choice, their bodies were treated as vessels for investment. They endured repeated pregnancies, often without rest or medical care. High maternal mortality was one consequence. The children who survived were entered into baptismal registers or plantation records, often tagged by their father's name for accounting purposes. The process mirrored animal husbandry. Just as cattle were bred for strength or milk production, enslaved people were paired to maximize output. This was not incidental, it was deliberate policy, adopted by planters across São Paulo after the trade ban. Evidence for these practices survives in fragments. Many official records were destroyed in the 1890s, when the Brazilian state ordered the burning of slavery-era documents to erase the legal footprint of the institution. What remains are baptismal registers, estate inventories, and scattered plantation ledgers. In these documents, children were often listed under their mother's name but annotated with the father's identity when the father was considered valuable. In São Paulo, families of enslaved people were routinely split, children were sold, traded, or transferred as needed. The ledgers treat them as economic entries, capital gains in human form. Oral histories fill the gaps left by destroyed archives. Descendants in Santa Eudóxia recount stories of Pata Seca being lent to neighboring estates, forced to father children with women he had never met before. This suggests a system of exchange. Enslavers could borrow a man like him much as they might borrow a bull to serve as cattle. Estimates vary, but conservative counts place the number of children attributed to Pata Seca at 200 or more. Some oral accounts suggest as many as 300. If his reproductive exploitation began in late adolescence and continued until abolition in 1888, this would mean a new child fathered every 2 to 3 months for over 4 decades. This was not unusual in principle, but the scale attributed to him was extraordinary. It was the combination of his physical attributes, the demand of São Paulo's coffee economy, and the desperation of planters to sustain their labor supply that produced such staggering numbers. Behind these numbers lay trauma. For the women, repeated pregnancies without rest meant weakened bodies, miscarriages, and death. For the children, survival was uncertain, many died young from disease or malnutrition. For Pata Seca himself, it meant a life where his most intimate role was stripped of humanity and turned into routine. Reports describe him as quiet, reserved, and isolated. He was not permitted to form a family of his choosing. Romantic bonds could not develop when every encounter was orchestrated by enslavers. The very idea of fatherhood was corrupted, because his children were not his to raise or protect. This distortion of family life was not accidental, it was part of the system. By breaking bonds, by scattering siblings across estates, by treating parents as interchangeable, the institution of slavery prevented solidarity and ensured control. Brazil's forced reproduction practices must be understood within a wider Atlantic framework. In the United States, slave breeding became especially prominent after 1808, creating a domestic trade that moved enslaved people from the Upper South to the Deep South. In the Caribbean, similar policies were applied on sugar plantations. Brazil's version had unique features. It continued longer, until the very eve of abolition, and it operated on a massive scale because Brazil had imported more Africans than any other country in the Americas. Religion played a contradictory role. Catholic priests baptized children born from these forced unions, entering their names into parish registers. Yet marriage between enslaved people was fragile, dependent on a master's approval, and could be broken at any moment. The church offered ritual, but it did not stop the system. The coldest testimony comes from the numbers themselves. Plantation ledgers, when preserved, show notations such as, Maria, child of Joaquina by Pata Seca. Each line was both a birth record and an economic entry. Children were catalogued like assets, their parentage tracked because it added value. For planters, this was success, proof that their system was generating wealth. For the people recorded, it was another form of erasure, their lives reduced to entries in an account book. One such ledger from São Paulo, fragmentary but still legible, shows columns of names, dates, and paternity notations. To read it today is to confront the brutal arithmetic of slavery. Each child's name sits beside a calculation of age, labor potential, or estimated value. The records were not intended as history. They were meant as accounting. But they survive as evidence, exposing the machinery that transformed human life into profit. Those columns tell us more than any planter's diary could. They prove how human reproduction itself became a market calculation. But numbers alone cannot reveal the cost, because the ledgers never counted the bodies broken, the mothers lost, the children scattered. To understand that cost, we must turn to the daily lives of the women and children themselves. The system of forced reproduction at plantations like Santa Eudóxia was not just an economic strategy written in ledgers, it was a daily reality inscribed on the bodies of women. They carried the weight of reproduction without choice, without rest, and without the ability to protect their children from a system that claimed them as property. Women in Brazilian slavery bore the heaviest cost. Enslavers saw them not as individuals but as breeding stock, valued primarily for their capacity to bear children who could be raised into laborers. A woman in her teens or 20s might be forced into one pregnancy after another with little or no recovery time between births. The physical toll was devastating. Constant pregnancies depleted their strength and nutrition. Without medical care, complications were frequent: hemorrhage, infections, miscarriages, and death in childbirth. Contemporary records show that maternal mortality among enslaved women was significantly higher than among free women in the same regions. To the plantation, these deaths were not tragedies but losses. Some estate inventories list women who died in childbirth alongside broken tools or diseased cattle. The comparison was not figurative, it reflected how planters thought of their human property: interchangeable, replaceable, valuable only so long as they could produce. Consent was impossible in this system. Women were paired with men chosen by the master. Sometimes they were compelled to bear children by men from their own plantation, other times by enslaved men brought in from elsewhere. They had no voice in the matter. Survival often required strategies that outsiders might mistake for consent. Some women developed outward shows of compliance, pretending affection or passivity to avoid punishment. But this did not erase the reality: their bodies were coerced, their choices erased. Accounts from other slave societies suggest that some women attempted to resist reproduction, through herbal knowledge, abortifacients, or even infanticide. In Brazil, scattered reports indicate similar practices, though evidence is limited because such actions were criminalized and suppressed. What is clear is that every pregnancy represented a moment of powerlessness enforced by law and violence. The children born from these forced unions entered the world already owned. Baptismal registers provide some of the only surviving records of their existence. Priests dutifully recorded names, parents, and dates. Yet baptism did not confer freedom, it merely sanctified bondage. For mothers, baptism was bittersweet. It marked their child's entry into the Christian faith but also into a social system that defined them as property. Many knew their children could be sold away at any moment. The emotional cost of separation was one of the deepest wounds of slavery. Enslavers frequently sold children to other estates, often before they reached adolescence. Family ties were deliberately fractured to prevent solidarity. A mother might see several of her children scattered across distant plantations, never to reunite. Those who survived infancy faced hard lives from the start. Infant mortality rates among the enslaved were staggering. Malnutrition, poor sanitation, and lack of medical attention meant that many children died before the age of 5. Those who lived were quickly put to work. Even young children were assigned tasks: tending fires, carrying water, caring for smaller siblings. By adolescence, they were fully absorbed into field labor. For boys, this meant the endless cycle of planting and harvesting coffee. For girls, it meant not only labor but also the looming expectation of reproduction once they reached puberty. The psychological scars were lasting. Oral histories from Santa Eudóxia recall children growing up without knowledge of their full family connections. Half-siblings, sometimes dozens, were scattered across the region, unaware of their kinship. The deliberate fracturing of family made reunion nearly impossible. Baptismal registers are among the few documents that allow historians to reconstruct this history. In parishes near São Carlos, entries list dozens of children identified as offspring of enslaved women and, occasionally, of men like Seca. Each entry is brief: a name, a date, a mother's name, sometimes the father's. These records show patterns, clusters of births linked to the same father, indicating systematic reproduction. They also reveal the anonymity imposed on many mothers. Sometimes they appear only as Maria, enslaved of Fazenda X, their personal identities erased. The registers thus provide both evidence and silence. They testify that these children existed but tell us little of their fates, their personalities, or their relationships. The gaps remind us of how much was lost when slavery reduced people to numbers in a parish book. The combined suffering of women and children created a web of trauma that extended across generations. Mothers endured repeated pregnancies and the constant threat of separation. Children grew up without secure family bonds. Fathers like Pata Seca were stripped of the ability to claim or protect their children. This trauma was not incidental, it was foundational to the system. Enslavers knew that breaking families weakened resistance. They used reproductive control as a weapon, ensuring that enslaved people could not easily form kinship networks strong enough to challenge the plantation order. One example survives through oral tradition in Santa Eudóxia. A woman named Benedetta, enslaved on the same plantation, was reportedly forced to bear multiple children by Pata Seca. Parish records show the baptism of 2 of her infants within 3 years, both marked as children of Benedetta, enslaved, by Roque José Florêncio. The oral story says that one of those children was sold away before the age of 10. Benedetta never saw her child again. Neighbors remembered her grief, describing her as a woman who sang laments in the fields, her voice carrying across the rows of coffee trees. Whether this account is entirely accurate cannot be confirmed, but the fragments, baptismal records and oral memory, converge on the same truth. Women like Benedetta lived through repeated cycles of forced pregnancy, only to lose the children they had been compelled to bear. When we add these stories together, the numbers grow overwhelming. Hundreds of children attributed to Pata Seca, dozens of women forced into pregnancies, countless separations and deaths. But numbers alone do not capture the cost. The plantation ledgers counted children as property. Parish registers recorded them as baptisms. But who counted the lives lost in childbirth? Who counted the mothers who died unnamed? Who counted the grief of women like Benedetta, whose children were torn from them? The answer is simple: no one in power. These lives went largely unrecorded, their suffering erased by the system that created it. The human toll was left for descendants to carry and for historians to piece together from fragments. If the ledgers and registers counted property but ignored suffering, where can we find the full truth? To answer that, we must look beyond the daily toll and turn to the laws, the resistance, and the political pressures that began to unmake the system. By the 1870s, Brazil's slavery regime stood on unsteady ground. International pressure, domestic resistance, and the sheer weight of human exploitation combined to make reform unavoidable. Yet change came slowly, and every reform carried contradictions that allowed slavery to persist for nearly 2 more decades. The first major step was the Lei do Ventre Livre, or the Law of Free Birth, passed in 1871. On paper, it seemed revolutionary. Children born to enslaved mothers after that date were declared free. But freedom in this case was a legal fiction. These children, though technically not enslaved, were required to remain under their master's control until adulthood. Enslavers could keep them as apprentices until the age of 21. For 2 decades, freeborn children labored under the same conditions as the enslaved. Their freedom existed only in theory, deferred until most of their youth had been spent in servitude. For women like those forced to bear Pata Seca's children, the law brought no relief. They remained bound, still compelled into reproduction. The law framed their children as future citizens, but it did not stop the system that commodified their fertility in the present. While elites debated reform in parliament, resistance was constant on the ground. Enslaved people sought freedom through small acts, slowing work, feigning illness, preserving African traditions, and through escape. Some fled individually, others joined quilombos, communities of fugitives hidden in forests and mountains. Quilombos had existed since the 17th century, the most famous being Palmares in northeastern Brazil, which resisted Portuguese forces for nearly a century. By the 19th century, smaller quilombos dotted the countryside, often close to plantations. They offered havens for fugitives but lived under constant threat of raids by militias and bounty hunters. Escape was perilous. Runaways faced dogs, armed patrols, and betrayal. If captured, punishments were brutal: whippings, mutilation, or sale to distant regions. Yet despite the risks, escapes continued, a testament to the determination for freedom. In São Paulo, oral history suggests that some of Pata Seca's children attempted flight. Whether they reached Quilombos or were recaptured is unknown, but the persistence of such stories reflects the reality: even within the tightest controls, people sought to carve out lives beyond bondage. By the 1870s, Brazil was the last nation in the Western world still maintaining legal slavery. Britain, which had once dominated the Atlantic slave trade, had abolished slavery in its empire by 1833 and exerted pressure on Brazil through diplomacy and trade. Abolitionist movements also grew within Brazil, fueled by intellectuals, journalists, and free black activists who demanded an end to the institution. The coffee economy itself contributed to mounting contradictions. Enslaved labor had made São Paulo wealthy, but the region's expansion created demand for European immigrants as well. By the 1880s, planters began experimenting with Italian and Portuguese labor, a shift that reflected the growing sense that slavery was nearing its end. The 1880s were marked by intensifying abolitionist campaigns. Societies formed to buy the freedom of enslaved individuals. Newspapers published accounts of cruelty. Activists organized public rallies and challenged the monarchy's slow pace. Some provinces declared emancipation locally, refusing to enforce the slave codes. Meanwhile, enslaved people continued to resist directly. Mass escapes increased, and in some regions, whole groups abandoned plantations. Their absence accelerated the collapse of the system more than parliamentary debates ever could. By 1888, the monarchy could no longer maintain the contradiction. On May 13, Princess Isabel signed the Lei Aurea, the Golden Law, which abolished slavery outright. With a single stroke, over 700,000 people were declared free, the last enslaved population in the Americas. Yet abolition raised immediate questions. What did freedom mean? The law freed people but provided no land, no compensation, no reparations. Most formerly enslaved had no property or resources. Many remained tied to the plantations as low-paid workers or sharecroppers. For men like Pata Seca, who had been enslaved for his entire life, freedom came late. By 1888 he was already elderly, his body worn by decades of forced labor and reproductive exploitation. Oral histories say he received a parcel of land and lived there with his partner Palmyra and a few of his children. But his freedom came after the prime of his life had already been spent in captivity. The contradictions of the Lei do Ventre Livre illustrate the larger problem. Laws declared freedom but delayed its reality. Resistance made slavery increasingly untenable, but abolition did not guarantee equality. The question was not only legal but existential: what did freedom mean to those who had never known it? To women who had lost children to sale? To men who had been used as breeding instruments? To children who grew up never knowing their siblings? The abolition of 1888 closed one chapter but opened another. It left unresolved questions of justice, memory, and repair that Brazil still grapples with today. Legal freedom arrived in 1888. But what did that freedom mean for someone like Pata Seca, a man whose entire life had been defined by captivity, exploitation, and control? To answer that, we must look at his later years and the legacy he left behind. When Brazil abolished slavery in 1888, Roque José Florêncio, known in oral memory as Pata Seca, was an old man. He had spent more than 6 decades in bondage, first as a field worker and then as a body pressed into reproductive service. Abolition freed him, but freedom came at the far end of a life already marked by loss and exploitation. Local tradition in Santa Eudóxia records that after emancipation, Pata Seca received a parcel of land from his former master. Whether this gift was generosity, calculation, or an attempt to quiet the past is unclear. The grant was small by plantation standards but significant for a man who had been denied ownership his entire life. Land meant the possibility of self-sufficiency. For the first time, Pata Seca could cultivate crops for his own household rather than for the wealth of others. Yet independence was fragile. The soil had been depleted by years of intensive coffee farming, and freed people often faced hostility from neighbors who resented their presence. Even so, the land allowed him to anchor himself in place. It gave him a home where he could gather family, not the hundreds of children forced through him, but the few he would claim as his own. Oral histories state that Pata Seca married a woman named Palmyra after emancipation. Unlike the coerced pairings of his enslaved years, this was a union of his own choosing. Together they raised 9 children. The symbolism was powerful. Out of a life where fatherhood had been weaponized against him, he carved a space to reclaim family. For the first time, his role as husband and father was based on choice, intimacy, and protection rather than compulsion. Yet the shadows of his past could not be erased. Every family gathering carried the unspoken knowledge that beyond the 9 children he raised with Palmyra, there were hundreds of others scattered across São Paulo, half-siblings who might never know each other. The network of kinship was vast but fractured, too large to comprehend. How many of Pata Seca's children survived into adulthood remains uncertain. Conservative estimates place the number at over 200, oral traditions sometimes raise it higher. If even half lived into maturity, the result was a kinship network spread across dozens of towns and plantations. This dispersed descent carried complex consequences. On one hand, it created genetic ties that link hundreds of families in São Paulo today back to one man. On the other, it was built on coercion, erasure, and the breaking of women's autonomy. For descendants, this produces a paradox. To trace lineage to Pata Seca is to inherit both survival and trauma. His children carried forward lives despite the system, but the circumstances of their conception mean that every story of descent carries the weight of slavery's violence. In Santa Eudóxia and surrounding towns, some families identify themselves as descendants of Pata Seca. Oral genealogies pass down his name, and reunions sometimes bring together branches of the extended network. Yet not everyone embraces the association. For some, the legacy is pride in survival. For others, it is a reminder of exploitation. Historians caution against treating him as a simple patriarchal founder. Unlike family heads in free societies, he did not choose his role as progenitor of hundreds. The plantation imposed it upon him. His legacy is therefore not one of voluntary fatherhood but of coerced descent. This distinction matters. To frame him as a father of many is to risk repeating the logic of the plantation, which celebrated his reproductive capacity as an asset. To honor him is to confront the system that denied him the dignity of choosing his own family. In the town of Santa Eudóxia, a statue commemorates Pata Seca. Sculpted as a towering figure, it depicts him as the giant remembered in oral stories. Tall, broad, powerful. For some residents, it stands as a tribute to resilience, a way of preserving memory in a place where so much of slavery's history was erased. But the statue is contested. Critics argue that it risks glorifying his role as breeder rather than honoring his humanity. By emphasizing his size and fertility, it echoes the very logic the plantation imposed on him. Others argue that the statue should instead highlight his survival and his attempt to form a chosen family after emancipation. The debates reflect a deeper struggle over how to remember slavery in Brazil. Should Pata Seca be celebrated as a symbol of strength, pitted as a victim, or honored as a survivor? The answer depends on how communities interpret the fragments of his life. In his final years, Pata Seca reportedly lived quietly with Palmyra and their children. He died sometime in the early 20th century, remembered locally as a man who had fathered hundreds but chosen only a few to call his family. His life after emancipation shows both the possibilities and the limits of freedom. He gained land, family, and some measure of dignity, but the scars of his past could not be erased. The forced children remained scattered, their mother's grief unrecorded, their lives only partially visible in church registers. Freedom did not heal the fracture. It simply allowed him to live the last chapter on his own terms, however briefly. In Santa Eudóxia, the statue of Pata Seca still stands, a giant cast in bronze, both honored and questioned. But what does this memorial really mean? Is it remembrance, or is it repetition of the very logic that enslaved him? To answer that, we must turn to the broader legacy of his story in Brazil's memory today. The story of Pata Seca does not end with his death, nor with the abolition of slavery in 1888. It lingers, in the land, in the families of São Paulo, and in the unresolved debates about what a nation owes to those who endured centuries of exploitation. At the heart of Brazil's slavery system was an economic calculation, that human reproduction could be converted into profit. Each child forced into the world by men like Pata Seca and women compelled to bear them represented future labor and market value. Historians estimate that by the mid-19th century, the average price of an enslaved field hand in São Paulo could equal years of a small farmer's income. If Pata Seca fathered 200 children, the economic benefit to planters was immense, tens of thousands of milreis in potential value. Adjusted for today, this would equal millions of dollars in stolen labor and human capital. These figures matter for current debates on reparations. Advocates argue that the wealth of Brazil's coffee boom, built on exploitation, seeded fortunes still visible today in landholding families and regional development. The labor and reproductive suffering of enslaved people generated profits whose benefits were never shared with their descendants. The legacy is not only economic but biological. Hundreds of families in São Paulo trace partial descent to Pata Seca. Oral traditions preserve this memory, but modern science raises new questions. DNA research can, in theory, map genetic lineages and reveal how widespread his ancestry became. Yet this opens ethical dilemmas. Who has the right to use DNA to reconstruct such histories? Should descendants be asked to confirm ties that were created by violence? Can genetic evidence ever capture the trauma of forced paternity, or does it risk reducing suffering back to numbers and charts? The debate is ongoing. For some descendants, tracing their connection to Pata Seca provides a sense of identity and survival. For others, it feels like reopening wounds, acknowledging kinship born from coercion rather than love. The challenge extends into education. How should stories like Pata Seca's be taught? For decades, Brazilian schools minimized the brutality of slavery, presenting abolition as a gift from Princess Isabel rather than the culmination of centuries of resistance by enslaved people. Only recently has there been more emphasis on centering the voices of those who lived through captivity. Remembering Pata Seca requires balance. To frame him only as a father of hundreds risks repeating the logic of enslavement, reducing him again to reproductive function. To ignore him is to erase the testimony preserved by descendants. The task is to tell his story as both survival and violation, to acknowledge resilience without minimizing violence. The statue in Santa Eudóxia embodies this tension. To some, it stands as a monument of endurance, to others, as an uncomfortable reminder of how he was valued. The debates around the statue reveal a society still uncertain of how to remember slavery honestly. The reckoning with slavery in Brazil remains incomplete. Abolition freed individuals but offered no reparations, no land reform, no national apology. Many descendants of the enslaved remain in conditions of poverty linked directly to the dispossession of their ancestors. For the story of Pata Seca, this raises the final question: what obligations remain? Is it to repair the economic theft by acknowledging the value extracted from his forced children? Is it to recover the dignity of the women who bore them? Is it to ensure that future generations learn the truth rather than sanitized versions of the past? These questions have no easy answer, but they cannot be avoided. To confront Pata Seca's story is to confront Brazil's history itself. The records may count children, land, and profits, but they cannot count the loss. That burden falls to us, the living. The question is whether we will carry it forward in silence, or whether we will finally confront the obligations left unfulfilled. The story of Pata Seca forces us to look directly into the machinery of slavery, not only as chains, whips, and fields, but as a system that reached into the most intimate corners of life. His towering body, turned into an instrument of forced paternity, generated wealth for others while denying him the dignity of family on his own terms. Yet his life was more than numbers in ledgers. It was survival against a system that measured human worth in profit. It was a man who, after decades of captivity, reclaimed a fragment of freedom in land, in marriage to Palmyra, and in the children he chose to raise. His story is not one of triumph or defeat, but of endurance, and of the questions left for us to answer. Because what remains unfinished is not only the reckoning with his memory but with slavery itself. The wealth it built still shapes Brazil. The wounds it inflicted still echo across families. And the obligations it created remain unsettled. That is why remembering matters. To tell his story is to refuse silence, to insist that the lives erased from the record are brought back into history. If you want more evidence, first history told with this clarity and weight, support Disturbing Tale. Subscribe now, share this story, and leave a comment with the hardest question you believe history still owes us an answer to. Together, we carry these stories forward, not as relics, but as unfinished truths demanding justice.